In this lecture, I'm going to talk about Friedrich Hayek, who lived from 1899 to 1992. The structure of the lecture is as follows. I'm going to start with some preliminaries and a bit of background. Then I'm going to talk about the early Hayek, who was a mild socialist, and the impact on him of the economist Ludwig von Mises. I'm then going to talk about some of Hayek's most characteristic ideas. His ideas about knowledge, his ideas about undesigned and imperfect institutions, and his critique of the ideal of social justice. From this, I'm going to turn to the implications that the material that I've discussed up to that point have for socialism, to his book, The Road to Serfdom, and also to Hayek's ideas about the notion of the rule of law. I'm then going to turn to some of the later work of Hayek, the work of his old age, and finally to talk a little bit about the heritage of Hayek, about open problems and issues left by his work. Let me turn then to some preliminaries. First, I have to make a personal confession. I became seriously interested in Hayek's work in the 1970s. Indeed, in the early 1970s, I wrote a PhD dissertation on his political thought. I subsequently published a book about him. And I actually think that his work is of immense importance for how we should think about our society and for a number of problems that we're facing today. Who was he? Well, he was Austrian-born, he was an economist and a philosopher. In the 1930s, he moved from Austria to the UK and became a British citizen. He spent many years in the US at the University of Chicago and ended his life teaching and working back in Austria and Germany. He is well known in a number of different academic fields. In 1974, he got a Nobel Prize in economics. For some of his early work, they highlighted particularly work on the theory of money and economic fluctuations, and for his analysis of the interdependence of economic, social, and institutional phenomena. Subsequent to this, to the work for which he got the Nobel Prize, he worked largely on issues in social and legal philosophy, but he's also produced some distinguished work in the history of ideas, and is in addition known for some interesting ideas in psychology. He really is a polymath. Hayek also, though, was very much a public intellectual. He just wasn't the kind of professor who simply stays in his study writing. He wrote a book called The Road to Serfdom, a controversial critique of economic planning, and he was the founder of an association called the Montpellier Society, which became an important association of libertarian and conservative intellectuals. Hayek was a prolific author. His most important works, just because he's done so much, are difficult to pick out, but I think one might mention his Pure Theory of Capital, is a technical work on economics, his book The Sensory Order on problems in psychology, but in my view, his key works are Individualism and Economic Order, The Road to Serfdom, and The Constitution of Liberty, all of which are dealing with issues in social and political philosophy. Why, you might ask, does he matter? Well, first, he's important for historical reasons. He exercised an important historical influence on politics at different times. First of all, immediately after the Second World War, his work on issues and problems about planning was influential both in the UK and in the US. In the 1970s and 1980s, he was rediscovered by people who became staffers and influential in the Thatcher and Reagan governments. Second, I think he's important because he's responsible for the argument, now pretty widely accepted, that the traditional understanding of socialism, namely that socialism means that you get away from markets and replace them by central economic planning, by a notion of complete social ownership of the means of production, is problematic, and that at the very least, if one is attracted to socialist ideals, one needs to find new ways to pursue them other than that traditional way of doing it. That socialism, in a sense, needs to be radically rethought if it is still going to be viable. And finally, here it seems to me that there are problems that are still outstanding, as it were, raised by Hayek's work, which it will be very important for us to pursue. Let me turn then to the origins of Hayek's distinctive approaches, to his own early socialism, and to the impact made on him by the economist von Mises. As a young man, Hayek was really moved by bad social conditions, particularly, I think, the situation in Vienna around and especially after the First World War, when really the situation of many people in Vienna was very, very grim. There was a lot of dire poverty, and Hayek was prompted by this towards a form of mild socialism. After a training as an economist and a brief period in the US, he returned to Vienna and there worked with an economist called Ludwig von Mises. Now, Mises had argued that what he termed economic calculation under socialism was impossible. To understand Mises' argument, we need really to understand what economic calculation is all about, and we need to distinguish two things: technical superiority on the one side and economic superiority on the other. What is technical superiority? Well, imagine there are two different ways in which a particular product could be made, and you could imagine, with a bit of generosity, that one process for doing this is just simply more efficient in all dimensions than another one. So that, for example, if to make a particular product you need a variety of different components, you could imagine, for example, the new updated mechanism, the new version of it, cuts down on all the different supplies that are needed. Now, in that case, you would say that the new machine was technically superior to the older one, and you would say, well, on grounds simply of efficiency, you'd choose that rather than working with the older one if you had a choice. Economic superiority is a bit more tricky. It's much more a phenomenon of the real world, because what will often happen is if there are two different alternative ways of doing things, one of them may use more of some factors of production than does the other, but the other one may use more than does that. That's to say, you may be in a situation where one way of doing things uses more of some components, and the other way of doing it uses more of other components. How are you going to evaluate which one of these you should use? Now, Mises' argument was essentially that in a market-based economy, one can make such a decision because prices generated within the market are a good guide to alternative possible uses of the products. I mean, that's to say that all different kinds of people's decisions feed in to what a particular thing costs, and you can use prices to guide you as to which of the processes to use, namely you go for the one that's cheaper. And what Mises wanted to argue was that you simply don't have access to that kind of information, and thus you simply can't do economic calculations if there aren't markets. And he said, look, socialists today, at the time that he was writing, are proposing that we should get rid of markets, but if they do, rather than gaining in economic efficiency as they were hoping for, they'll find themselves in a situation where they simply can't make this kind of economic evaluation without markets. This claim, as you can imagine, led to a lot of controversy. Hayek, I think, was very impressed by, because he was a socialist, he was somewhat challenged by, but in the end he was really pretty impressed by the broad arguments that Mises was making, although he didn't think in some respects that the argument was quite right, and Hayek sat down and reworked and thought about some of these things and joined in a sense, with the argument to and fro about Mises' work, and it's out of this that some of Hayek's key arguments come. This leads me, indeed, to some of Hayek's key arguments about knowledge, about undesigned and imperfect institutions, and his critique of social justice. Let me start off by really Hayek's key redevelopment of Mises' views and the argument about the so-called social division of knowledge. Here it is useful to recall Adam Smith and his theme of the social division of labour, the way in which in a market-based economy and what Smith called a commercial society, the activities of various different lots of people in an economy can be coordinated not by someone telling each of them what they need to do, but rather by their being guided by their economic self-interest and prices. And Hayek said, there is, in addition to a social division of labour, there is what could be termed a social division of information or of knowledge. Knowledge is scattered through a society. For example, what are people's tastes? If someone wanted to go and invite some people they hadn't met before for a drink, would they know, if they were relative strangers, what they would like to drink? What are their tastes like? What about knowledge, which is dependent on particular situations? You may have someone who just knows, for example, what the market is like for a particular crop because of that situationally based knowledge. There's also all kinds of skills and tacit knowledge. Take someone, for example, who is a successful market trader. I mean, someone who may set up perhaps in a particular part of Washington, D.C., servicing people, selling goods to people who are coming out of the metro. That person is likely to know just what those people will want, but may find it very difficult to communicate. I mean, suppose that person was a friend of yours, they were ill, and you said, "Oh, I'm happy to go to the wholesalers, you tell me what I should buy." They might well say, "I'm sorry, I can't do that. You know, I know my customers, but I simply can't articulate this kind of knowledge." And what Hayek wanted to argue is there is within an economy all of this knowledge that different people possess, which can't be centralized. It can't be made available to central economic planners. But, he wanted to argue, market mechanisms allow for decentralized decision-taking, and thus for the utilization of this sort of scattered knowledge, because individuals can make use of it in the different situations in which they find themselves. I mean, basically what he's saying is that if you have a market economy with individuals, you know, particular individuals taking decisions, they can be guided by prices, but they can then act on the local information that they have got. They can act on the basis of their own individual know-how, and so feed that knowledge into the overall decision-making processes in society, where if you insisted on the decision-making processes being centralized and said to all of those people, "Would you mind writing in that information?" I mean, they probably couldn't do it, and even if the information was somehow furnished, the people operating centrally wouldn't know what to do with it in that form. Hayek also wanted to draw some wider lessons from this material. In particular, he wanted to say that in this case, one can discover that markets, which were already in place, I mean, these things were working, had features to them and what they enabled us to do that we hadn't realized. That it was only, in a sense, when people suggested getting rid of markets and replacing it by central planning, that one could then start to understand, you know, by critical reflection, some of the things that our institutions are accomplishing, which we hadn't actually realized that they were accomplishing. An undesigned social institution, something that someone hasn't deliberately set up, turns out to be playing a key role. And in this respect, he says, we mustn't look down on institutions. Things which we've inherited traditionally, we mustn't poo-poo them just because they haven't been deliberately designed. There may be all kinds of useful social functions that are being discharged by institutions which haven't been deliberately planned. Other examples he gave were language. It sort of evolves. It enables us to do all kinds of things, but no one sat down and deliberately planned it. He's also pointed at other times to the tradition of common law as performing all kinds of useful functions in society without anyone deliberately setting out and saying, let us plan something which will do this. Indeed, there's a parallel in this respect between the lessons that Hayek wanted to draw for us taking, in some ways, a kind of conservative approach towards institutions, thinking there may be some kind of wisdom in them that we may not have appreciated, and what happened in Adam Smith, where he talked about the role of prices and incentives and so on, and then, in a sense, generalized from that to the notion of an invisible hand. You have a similar kind of move going on in Hayek's work. Another vitally important feature of Hayek's argument, it seems to me to be, is that he recognized that given the role that is played by economic self-interest in this context, a society like ours may be in some important ways morally imperfect. For example, it may run on greed, but in ways that we can't really do anything about. That's to say, it may turn out that some things are genuinely morally a little bit unpleasant. I mean, there's a sense in which some conservatives may wish to try and defend anything that goes on in a market setting, but I think more realistically one can say, yeah, you know, a lot of stuff is fine, but there may also be people who really are, you know, not doing things that are terribly nice, but nonetheless what they're doing may play a really important role, just because if they weren't doing that, then things would run much less efficiently. It seems to me it should have been in those sorts of terms that the film Wall Street, say, should have offered a defense for the activities of its entrepreneur in terms of the wider benefits to society of the rather tacky efforts that were going on. And certainly I think Hayek confronts us with this, namely, we may be able to make important moral criticisms of our institutions, we may say they are really imperfect, but that doesn't necessarily mean we can move to anything better if we still want certain important social tasks undertaken. All of this indeed led Hayek to develop a criticism of the ideal of social justice. Hayek argued that the economic system uses prices, and thus what we get by way of wages and so on, for the purposes of transmitting information about and also for motivating people. But he made the key point that this means that the rewards that people get within such a society, the prices we get for our services, say, don't depend on merit. Let me give you an example. I work sometimes in a department of philosophy, and one could well imagine that in the same corridor with very similar backgrounds, there are two philosophy professors, both working on issues to do with logic. One of them, equally good with another one, may just have a reasonable academic career. The sad truth is that professors don't get paid all that much, and, live a quiet life and so on. His colleague just down the corridor suddenly discovered that the work that he's been doing of a completely abstract kind, very similar to the other guy's work, just happens to have important implications for new developments in the writing of software. Suddenly, the guy is flown from perhaps the small liberal arts college in the Midwest where he's been working across to Seattle. He's given a salary offer of just unbelievable proportions. This is the way in which a market-based society works. This guy has got no more merit than had his other colleague. They got similar careers, similar diligence, equally good or bad at teaching or whatever. But it just so happens that because of the usefulness to other people of what this guy is doing, he suddenly gets a huge payoff, and his colleague back home is saying, I don't understand this. Things just are not fair. There is no way in which this guy has got merits that go beyond mine, and yet I'm stuck on my small salary in a poky Midwest town, and this other guy is off in Seattle with Bill Gates and whatever. Okay, what Hayek is saying is that because of the social role that these systems of prices play, you simply don't have room for rewarding them just on the basis of merits. Indeed, he wanted to argue you can't do so in a market-based society. You can't change systematically rates of pay so as to make them track what people merit, and thus he wanted to argue the ideal of social justice in the sense of what people get for their work, fitting their merit, just makes no sense in a setting where you're making use of the mechanisms of a market-based society. It is, as it were, that those mechanisms are already doing other work, and if they're going to do that other work, then they can't at the same time reward people on the basis of merit, in the sense of rewards for diligence, for conscientiousness, and so on, just because they are needed to give that kind of differential between work which has got applications which are of benefit to lots of other people and work which hasn't. This doesn't mean, I should stress, that from Hayek's perspective, you can't have a welfare safety net to assist people who are doing that. His own view was, yeah, it's fine if your society is rich enough to be able to handle it, to have a welfare system, but you need to keep that outside of the market rather than trying to change the system of rewards and so on within markets to make that more egalitarian or more fitting notions of merit. Because if you do that, you're mucking up the mechanisms which we need to play other roles. From all of this, let me turn to his work on the road to serfdom and his ideas about the rule of law. Hayek's argument about knowledge had important implications for socialism. First of all, he wanted to say that it really hits the notion that you could have central planning as an alternative to, or as a substitute for markets. He just wanted to say you can't run a socialist society if that means a fully planned society, and at the same time get the benefits of the effective use of socially dispersed knowledge. In his own case, he still personally had sympathy for socialist ideals and for a measure of egalitarianism quite a way into his life. Later on, these sort of ideals seem to have been dropped. He doesn't really give an explanation for why he dropped them, but for a long time, a certain personal sympathy with socialist ideals ran alongside the development of the arguments that I've been dealing with. And indeed, some socialists, for example, Lord Plant in the UK, David Miller in the UK, two academics, one of them moved to the House of Lords. In the US, the economist John Romer, look for ways of pursuing egalitarian socialist ideals in ways that are compatible with Hayek's argument. They take Hayek's argument seriously. They say it hits traditional interpretations of socialism, but what we want to do is to take, in a sense, the humane spirit of socialism and find other ways of reinterpreting it. Others contest Hayek's argument and say there must be some flaws in it. Hayek, in addition to developing the ideas I've talked about so far, also offered a critique of central planning in his book The Road to Serfdom. What he wanted to argue is that the fact that there may be difficulties about central planning doesn't mean that people may not try to plan a society. And Hayek's argument was that the systematic pursuit of this would lead to terrible problems and a loss of freedom. I mean, basically, that if in the face of problems coming up, people say, well, what we need to do is to take on more power, put more power in the hands of the state to sort these out. If you go along that line, he said, we'll run into real difficulties. Why? Well, at bottom, he said, people may have incompatible preferences and priorities. Differences here that actually can't be resolved simply by way of rational argument. He said, in a market-based society with private property, people can, in a sense, agree to differ about these things and to pursue incompatible ideas, each person just using their own resources. But under central planning, where particularly there may be a commitment to using resources in a good and rational way, these issues have to be resolved. But think of an example. What about smoking? Typically, one's got something which some people want to do, some people are fine with. Other people think that it is just wrong, that it's just wicked, in a sense that any of this stuff should be going on at all, and indeed find lots and lots of ways to try and make it as uncomfortable as possible. But this is happening in a society in which, you know, it's agreed that people can do this, in a sense, in their own time and their own property. Consider a situation where there's collective decision-making. Would any of the people who are passionate non-smokers allow any resources to go on the production of this noxious product? Well, what about then the people who are all in favour of smoking? I mean, would one be able to resolve these disagreements in terms of collective decision-making in a fully rational way? Hayek wanted to argue that there are going to be all kinds of differences of this kind which just really aren't going to be susceptible to rational resolution. There are differences in tastes, differences perhaps in religious or ethical views, which you can't resolve by simple rational means. And his argument was that if you have a government, if you have central planners who are committed to resolving all problems rationally, the form of resolution can only be arbitrary, but if their legitimacy depends on what they're doing looking rational, this has, in a sense, to be then imposed on everyone else and made to look rational by using propaganda. In addition, he wanted to argue, within planned economies, there is a dangerous concentration of power, power which goes way beyond anything that's found within capitalist societies. There's a lot of controversy, for example, about Microsoft and the power and the wealth of Bill Gates. Now, you can have arguments one way or the other on this side, but clearly one could see that if he was wanting to do something, he'd have an enormous amount of clout. That is utterly trivial in terms of what the concentration of power would be in, say, a centrally planned US economy. And so Hayek was concerned about the sheer power that such decision-takers would have. And indeed, he was concerned about the difficulties of controlling democratically such a concentration of power. All told, Hayek wanted to argue, and this led to a lot of controversy, that persistence in an attempt to plan centrally will lead in the end to a loss of freedom. One of the readers of Hayek's Road to Serfdom was the economist John Maynard Keynes. Hayek sent him a copy, and Keynes was a leading economist with whom Hayek had been engaged in various bitter theoretical disagreements in the 1930s. Keynes, in fact, was surprisingly sympathetic to the book, but he raised a problem. He said, look, Hayek, you don't favour a system of strict laissez-faire. You have an agenda for governmental action. By your own argument, doesn't that mean that you yourself are on the slippery step, the top of the slippery slope towards serfdom? How are you going to respond to this? Now, I can't demonstrate that the ideas that Hayek developed were a direct response to Keynes' criticism, but certainly it looks to me as if they may be. And in particular, Hayek wrote something about the rule of law, which I think can be understood in this context. When Hayek wrote about the rule of law, he interpreted it in terms of law being equally applicable to all citizens, and also to the government, that the government should only do things that it's allowed to do under the law. The law also should be general in its character, accessible to citizens and not retrospective. Hayek had in The Road to Serfdom expressed the view that central planning might pose some problems with regard to its compatibility with the rule of law. Later, he suggested the rule of law as a criterion for when government action is or isn't going to put freedom in jeopardy. In effect, what he said was that it's a necessary condition for not risking people's freedom, not a sufficient condition in the sense that there may be all kinds of things that government can do which are ill-advised or which may be problematic, but at the very least, if what government is doing is compatible with the rule of law, if government's actions fit these general criteria, then you're not going to be running into the kind of problems that The Road to Serfdom suggested you'd get otherwise from governmental action. That's to say, he seemed to be suggesting appeal to this could help to get round Keynes's challenge. And it turns out in the end that the ideal of the rule of law has three different facets in Hayek's work. On the one side, it forms the institutional basis for economic activity of the kind that you get in an extended market-based society. It is a precondition for the effective use of the social division of knowledge. It serves, as I indicated, as a criterion for when government action is in order, and it also related to Hayek's understanding of individual freedom. Individuals, in his view, are free, provided that they're not being singled out for arbitrary action by government, provided, as it were, laws are being made in purely general terms. From this, let me turn to Hayek's later work. From his reaction to Mises onwards, Hayek had a tendency to generalize lessons from economics to talk more generally about unplanned institutions, not just in an economic context, a bit like Adam Smith did with regard to the invisible hand. At times, Hayek's critique of planning and radical reform was presented as a critique of rationalistic approaches to society, a little along the lines of Edmund Burke. Later, under the impact of the Italian legal philosopher Bruno Leone, Hayek became concerned about some uncertainties that may follow from legislative changes to the legal system. He was worried that, say, Congress might constantly keep changing the law so that people couldn't really do long-term planning. And he came in the end to say that there should be much more emphasis on common law processes in legal formation rather than the making of law being in the hands of Congress. In his later writings, Hayek often presented a somewhat conservative view of the superiority of unplanned social institutions or traditions over anything designed, again a bit like Burke, which he backed up in some of his later writings with some, I think, not altogether successful ideas about how they might evolve through a process of social evolution. But these ideas were always found alongside and in some ways in tension with support for the kind of critical rationalist approach the one got in the work of his friend Karl Popper. So there were tensions there. What about the heritage of Hayek? Well, first of all, I think Hayek's views, certainly to me, seem both stimulating and challenging. They develop out of his critique of socialist planning and out of his ideas on the social division of knowledge. If one accepts them and that we need markets, then they suggest that we need to change radically some of our other ideals, at the very least how we interpret socialism or how we interpret notions of social justice. His ideas about freedom and the rule of law are striking, but several scholars have said, well, in the end, we're a bit dubious about whether they really do work. Also, I think, Hayek's writings suggest many other important issues. For example, his stress on the social division of knowledge seems to me to lead to the problem, okay, you've talked about tacit knowledge within society, and how one can handle that by way of economic incentives and prices. What about tacit knowledge within organizations? Take a large organization, there'll be tacit knowledge there. How is this made available to the people who are taking the key decisions? And there is, in a sense, I think, a challenge from Hayek's work, if you take it seriously, in terms of thinking, how does it apply to issues of organizational design and management? And I think there's some interesting links between this and issues that are being explored today under the heading of knowledge management within the management literature. I'm now at the end, and so may I just recapitulate where we've gone. After a few preliminaries, I talked about Hayek's early socialism and the impact that was made on him by Mises. I talked then about the key themes in his work of knowledge, undesigned and imperfect institutions, and his critique of social justice. I then talked about the application of these things to socialism, his road to serfdom and his ideas about the rule of law, and finally about the later Hayek and some of the heritage of his work, some of the open problems that it leads to. Thank you very much.